Today is Sunday, so I'm going to have my little Sunday sit-down chat, a more casual discussion about something related to game design and game mechanisms. Last night I played Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition. Now, I played this before. I have a video about my favorite mechanism in it. I can't remember what that mechanism is, but it was a while ago. Yesterday, though, we played the long scenario. I don't know if there's more than one at this point, but in the core game, I believe there's one long scenario. The estimated time length on the box, I think, was like 240 minutes through 360 minutes, or maybe 320 minutes. Like, the game is very upfront about it being a very long scenario. And a friend did a great job of hosting it. We played in almost complete darkness. We had flashlights. I had a terror tome. She projected the screen on the wall, which was awesome because I don't like looking at screens when I play games, but looking at it projected on a wall, it just interacts with my eyes differently, and everyone could see it. It was nice and big. It was really cool. And if you haven't played the scenario, I won't go into spoilers or anything like that here. Don't worry about that. But it was a 5-hour game, and I went into it thinking that I might leave early because I typically do not love long games that go over 3 hours. Right around 2 hours is my sweet spot, but I can go up to 3. But over 3, it starts to drag for me. So I wasn't sure if I was going to stay, and so I was pleasantly surprised that the first 4 hours were great. I was having a lot of fun. It reminded me a ton of Time Stories, which I'll talk about in a minute, where we were mostly just walking around, discovering stuff, having interactions. We could see the app on full display because we'd have like repetitive interactions and interactions that happen in different orders, and the app would remember all that stuff. And I think it changed the way some of the characters in the game talk to us. It was very much a game of discovery and exploration and order of operations, all stuff that I love. Then we got to the 5th hour, and it suddenly became stuff that I didn't love. Again, I don't want to go into spoilers, but basically, that's where like a lot of combat suddenly happens, and I don't particularly enjoy cooperative combat for some reason. I think I've realized that it doesn't engage me unless it's really fast. But if it's prolonged, repetitive combat, this is why I didn't enjoy Gloomhaven as I thought I would, because it's primarily a combat game, not a discovery and exploration game that I thought it was going to be. It's a tactical combat game, very well designed tactical combat game, but I just don't enjoy that type of combat. So anyway, the last hour of the game, and there were some puzzles too. The puzzles were awesome, but the combat part I did not enjoy all that much. And so the game went on. It suddenly felt long, which was weird because 4 hours flew by, did not feel all that long. My expectations were set on how long it was going to be, and then suddenly there was an extra hour tacked on there that wasn't as engaging, and it suddenly felt really long. And so it got me thinking about long games, and also now a day has passed, and I've thought about this game. And I've wondered, did those first 4 hours really need to be that long? Because basically you are walking around in 4 different environments. You go through 4 days, and you have to go through all 4 environments. And you discover stuff during those days, but the game doesn't let you truncate that. Like, you have to do 4 days. I think there are 4 rounds within each day, 4 different environments. And I was just trying to think, like, is the stuff that we learned, as interactive and as interesting as it was, did it actually need to be that long, or could they have cut out one of those days and had it be the same game? And so today I thought I'd explore some of the long games that I played and some questions, some like game design oriented questions about things that designers think about when they think about the length of the game, and things that you can do maybe to engage players in a longer game. And I'll say this up front from a game designer's perspective, something that I often do with my game designs is I decide how long I want the game to be. Like, I went into Charterstone wanting it to be a 60-minute game. And so there are elements of design that I incorporated into Charterstone, especially the end game trigger, that were built around that idea of me wanting it to be a 60-minute game. So I'm curious if some designers of these longer games that I'm gonna mention, did they go into it saying, I want this to be a 5-hour game, or was that a symptom of the design? And if they could go back, would they say, I wonder if, like, do other designers think of it this way? Do they think I want it to be this long, or I want it to be as long as it needs to be to give players the full experience of the game? So the first game, and I won't go into detail on many of these. I'll just briefly talk about my experience with each of these in terms of length. Eclipse, I think, was the first very long game that I played. And I'm excluding games from my youth. Like, for some reason when I was younger, like, long games just didn't bother me at all. Like, I played Risk for hours and it was fine. So Eclipse was the first one as an adult that I played that was truly a very long game. Oh, and I forgot one of them. I'll add them onto my little sticky note here. So Eclipse, yeah. I've only played Eclipse once because of the length. I've heard that some people can play it quite quickly. We played a 6-player game, a teaching game, that lasted 5.5 hours. I think it was 5.5. And generally, I do try to give games a buffer for being a learning game or a teaching game. I excuse them for some of the things that for the length, because I know that we learn the game. But 5.5 hours felt really long. And I think in particular the reason it felt really long was that one of the players was backed into a corner around the 3rd hour and just really could not get out. Two players picked on him. We're all friends. Somehow it happened. I don't know exactly how it happened. It wasn't me. But 2 people kind of picked on him, and he got backed into a corner, and he could not get out. And I admire him for not quitting, because I think that can kind of hurt the experience for everyone. He stuck with it, but he was pretty much not engaged for the final 2.5 hours because he just did not have the resources, the planetary control to get the resources and take meaningful turns. So he didn't have a meaningful turn for the last 2.5 hours of the game. And it didn't just impact him, but it impacted all of us, because all of us at that point were like, okay, we see this one person's out of the game. We want to accelerate the game for his benefit, and in a way that we can still be engaged and have fun, because the rest of us were still in it. Maybe what we should have just done is just let him go home and given him a free pass to go home. It's been a while, maybe we did that. I can't even remember at this point. But it made me think that a major thing in these games, actually no, I'll wait to get to the game design stuff in a minute. So that was our experience with Eclipse. The next one was Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones, I think, lasted about 6 hours for us. Again, I've only played it once because of that length. But I have a more favorable impression of Game of Thrones, I think, because we all felt like we were in it at all times. Even though if a player got behind or got backed into a corner, it suddenly made them... the level of negotiation in the game made those players really appealing to talk to, because they needed other players. So suddenly these alliances could form with those weaker players that kept them in the game, kept them engaged. So I felt engaged the whole time. The theme of the game I thought was excellent, which really helped. We were all really into the Game of Thrones theme. I think the show, it was maybe the 2nd season of the show, so we were all really into it. The show had just come back on, so we wanted to be immersed in that world for a while. And so that certainly helped the experience. At the same time, I haven't returned to it because I don't know if we could replicate that. Maybe we can. Maybe those of you who have played it more than once or play these long games a number of times can speak to that. But for me, it's like watching a really long movie more than once. Like it really has to draw me in again if I'm going to commit that amount of time to it a second time. Whereas I don't have a problem playing it one time. Like I actually think a one-time experience is very gratifying for a really long movie or a really long game, because I now have that experience, I have that memory, and I'm satisfied with it. What's the next one? The next one, I'm trying to do this chronologically. I think the next one was Caverna. Now, Caverna is a game that I have played probably half a dozen times, and most of the times I've played it were like 3-hour games. we maybe even got it down to 2, like 2.5, 3 hour games. But the first time we played it, it was late at night. It was at a convention, and it was with 7 people, all of which were a terrible idea. I really wanted to learn Caverna. No, actually, I had played Caverna earlier that day with a lower player count and had a so-so experience. And I thought, okay, I need to do like the epic version. I need to play where everyone's in it because the game plays up to 7. And so we did. We played up to 7, and it just dragged on and on and on. It was a really long game. It was definitely by far my worst experience playing Caverna. I had much better experiences of it. Obviously, I've come back to it. I really enjoy it. But yeah, that one, I think sometimes with Euro games, you just, the designer has to say, I'm not going to let players play a 7-player game of this or a 6-player game. And this was a tough choice I made with Scythe in particular when I released Invaders from Afar, which increased the player count to 6 or 7. Originally, my intent was that players could only still play it with 5 players, but I was throwing in 2 new player mats, so I knew that despite my warnings, players were still going to play with 6 or 7 players at times. So I needed to make sure through some design elements that the game would not drag on. Again, me keeping in mind the playing time, which is always on my mind as a designer, and to make sure it scaled to that player count. Fortunately, Scythe, if you play it correctly and you do overlapping turns, where if you're taking a bottom row action, the next player to your left can start to take their turn, the game can kind of fly by pretty quickly. And fortunately with Scythe, when you have more players on the board, there's more interaction, and it means more combat, and combat can accelerate at the end of the game. So we played 6-player games of Scythe in like 2 hours. Like I'm sure other people have had different experiences, but our experience has not been that it dragged on. But in this case, for Caverna, it did. And I've heard many reviewers recommend that you do not play Caverna with 6 or 7 players, which I agree. The next one, I believe, chronologically, was Fury of Dracula, which I've heard that people have played this in like an hour and a half to 2 hours. We played once on Halloween, and it lasted over 4 hours. And after like an hour, it was, for me, it was a big drag. And I think part of that is that I don't love hidden movement games. The only hidden movement game I truly love is Scotland Yard. And Scotland Yard teaches in 2 minutes and plays in like 45 minutes to an hour, which I think is the sweet spot for any game where you're stumbling around with limited knowledge, like extreme limited knowledge for an extended period of time. So Fury of Dracula, when it got past that hour mark, it started to drag, and then it was 2 hours and 3 hours and 4 hours with us stumbling around with limited information. And yeah, just didn't work. As I'm looking at this list, I'm realizing how many of these games are Fantasy Flight games. I wonder if this is just part of the brand of Fantasy Flight. We have Fury of Dracula, we have Game of Thrones, Mansions of Madness, which I mentioned, and the next one will be Twilight Imperium 4. I played that recently. Our game was 5 hours. I think it was a 5-player game for 5 hours, which, again, and this was actually really helpful. For these long games, I love it when they just admit up front that they are long games, and all of these games do that really, really well. I think they all do. Maybe not Eclipse. I don't know if that says on the box. And maybe not Fury of Dracula. But I like going in with the expectation that this is going to be a long game. I can mentally prepare myself. I can prepare like food or whatever you need to do as a host and budget my time that day around it. So I like when they're upfront about the time that it takes to play them. Twilight Imperium 4, the time passed pretty quickly. And I can see in Twilight Imperium how the time adds to the epic feel of it. It just wouldn't be the same game if you played it in 90 minutes or 2 hours. There's this epic build-up that happens. I do wonder a little bit if it could happen faster. There are certain mechanisms that just take a lot of time. But some of those are my favorite mechanisms, like the voting mechanism and the negotiation that goes hand in hand with it. Just takes time, and you if you want to give the players the freedom to have that negotiation, you need to give them the time to do so. So, yeah, that's a tough one. That I did not feel like the time dragged in Twilight Imperium, but it was also a 5-hour game. So I've heard the games of Twilight Imperium can go up to like 8 hours or even longer, and that definitely would have been too long for me. So I've kind of broached upon some of these questions. Like one of the questions I had was for game designers when they're thinking about the length is does the length make the game better? And I think this goes both ways. Does the shorter length of a game make it better? Does the longer length of a game make it better as well? And this is something that I try to ask myself when I design games. Is the length I've chosen for this game making the game better or worse? Like, could Charterstone have been a better game if I had made it a 2-hour game or a 30-minute game? And how do players' perceptions change based on that length of time? Like, I perceive a 20 to 30-minute game as a filler, even though and you have to streamline a lot of stuff out of a 20-30-minute game that makes it almost impossible for a 20 to 30-minute game to be considered epic and to have those memorable moments. Actually, no, that second part isn't true, because I've had plenty of games of like Avalon that go for 20 to 30 minutes, and they are memorable. They're not epic, but they are memorable. Another question is the length necessary? And this is what really came to mind today when I was thinking about Mansions of Madness. As much as I enjoyed the first 4 hours, in hindsight, I don't know if they were necessary. I think you probably could have given players the same experience, the same enriching experience of discovery and exploration in maybe 2 or 3 hours. I think several of those locations could have been cut out or made a little bit more concise. And I think it probably could have been very close to the same experience. But you may disagree. If you played the long scenario Mansions of Madness and you think the length was necessary, I'd love to hear why. Another factor is I think the game still needs to end at what feels like the right time to the players. So like in an engine building game, I like to have built up my engine, to use that engine, and then before it gets repetitive, to end the game. I think that's pretty crucial. So I think every game has like the right time that it needs to end based on the mechanisms in that game. And for Mansions of Madness, like I said, the first 4 hours were very solid, and the last hour felt like a drag. And so I think that's one area where if it had been a little bit shorter and some of those end game stuff, maybe they had happened a little bit earlier, not just time-wise, but like chronologically within the context of the game, I think that would have been better. But that's something to keep in mind. Like, at the point where the game is getting ready to end, is that the point where players are actually ready for it to end? Is it too soon, or is it too late? And last, I think it's so important to keep players engaged in the game at all times, for these longer games in particular. I say that with a caveat, though, because I found in longer games that I have... I didn't even get the time stories. I didn't mention... I'll end with time stories. That with these longer games, I feel like I have more permission to get up and like take a bathroom break or pretty much just bathroom breaks. In Mansions of Madness, we took a quick break after every round to kind of eat food and stand up and just chat for a minute and relax, and then we got back to the game. In a 2-hour game, I never feel like I never want to do that. I just want to move forward and end the game within that 2-hour time span. But with the longer game, I feel like you have a little bit more permission to stretch your legs and kind of take your time with the game, which is kind of nice. But at the same time, when you are actually playing the game, I think it is crucially important to keep players engaged at all times. This is what I think Game of Thrones did really well, and Twilight Imperium for the most part did very well, because players are engaged during most of the phases, that in Eclipse and maybe Fury of Dracula and Caverna didn't do as well with those longer games. I'll end with the game I almost forgot, Time Stories. I love Time Stories. It is my favorite game right now. And a session Time Stories can take between 3 and 5 hours. And I am engaged the entire time, and I love it the entire time. And it's just one of those games that I actually think one thing, like the one catch with Time Stories is that sometimes it can drag on a little bit, but the game kind of gives you permission to accelerate certain elements if you need to. Like, rather than doing an entire run from start to finish, if you're ready to end the game, you can just jump to a certain point and finish off the mission there. So I like that Time Stories kind of gives you the cooperative permission to accelerate the game if you need to. I don't think it officially says that anywhere in the game, but there's just the structure of the game allows you to do that. So I kind of like that in a longer game where the game just lets you jump forward if you get to that point, that tipping point where you're ready for the game to end. Now I've made a very long video about long games. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about longer games that you've enjoyed or not enjoyed, and what do you think for the games? Either way, what made like the length right? Like, what did the length make them better or worse? Was the length necessary? Did it end at the right time? Were you engaged at all times? Did you have clear expectations going into it that it was going to be that long? I'd love to hear your thoughts about all that, or on your thoughts on the long scenario of Mansions of Madness while it's still fresh on my mind. Thanks.